So the Wonder Man TV series came out about a month ago, and I thought it would be interesting to kind of compare the comics to the TV series and see how they're different from each other. Believe it or not, there are a lot of differences in a couple of different aspects, including his origin story and obviously some things that were completely new that were added into the show. So getting into it a little bit, starting with the origin. In the Wonder Man comics, Simon Williams doesn't start out as a kid when he gets his powers or, you know, hiding his powers at all. Um, he's already an adult when his life pretty much falls apart, and I'm referencing the Avengers issue 9, and I'm referencing this specific comic because it's the first comic he appears in, and it's the first one we get his origin story in, so I think it's important to the history of the character. Simon's the son of a rich industrialist, um, Sanford Williams, who ran Williams Innovations. And when Sanford dies, Simon takes over the company. Um, the problem is the business starts going downhill, and the origin specifically frames it as Williams Innovations getting squeezed by Tony Stark and Stark Industries, and things get worse fast, and Simon makes desperate choices to keep the company afloat. He tries to embezzle funds and gets caught, which leads him to being arrested and jailed. Um, and so that's when Baron Zemo enters the picture, and this is where the comic's origin is super specific. Zemo isn't some, random person offering help. He sees Simon's story in the news, notices that Simon blames Tony Stark, and realizes he's angry and easy to manipulate. Um, Zemo has Enchantress step in and get Simon out so he can be recruited. She pays his bail as part of the scheme. Simon agrees because he's bitter and wants payback, and he feels like he has nothing to lose. And then comes the actual power source. Zemo uses ionic ray treatments on Simon, which is what gives him the strength and durability and officially turns him into Wonder Man. Um, but the most important part, and something people forget, is that Zemo also uses fear to keep Simon on a leash. Zemo tells him the treatment will kill him within about a week unless he comes back for regular treatments, of an antidote, follow-up dose, which forces Simon to stay dependent on Zemo early on. And so Zemo literally names him Wonder Man and sends him to join the Avengers as a double agent with instructions to betray them at the worst possible moment so Zemo's masters of evil can destroy the team. But here's the twist that makes Simon work as a character. Once he's actually around the Avengers, he starts to change. He respects them, he hesitates, and instead of following through, he turns against Zemo's plan and chooses the heroes over the guy who created them. Now, in the show, we obviously don't know what his origin story is. It's kind of ambiguous. And so the Disney Plus series goes the other way with it. In the show, Simon's powers feel like something that started way earlier than when he was an adult. Um, when they reference the kitchen catching on fire, when Simon was a kid, kind of blaming him for that. You kind of get the idea that he had powers then. So the story kind of makes it seem like this has been in his life. He's been dealing with it forever. It's not something new, that he's experiencing as an adult. And the show doesn't really lock you into one clean origin the way the comics do. So it feels like he has these abilities and they keep coming out when he can't control them, essentially. And that's where the secrecy comes in. Because in the series, hiding isn't like a side detail, it's the whole story. Simon has been bottling it up, trying not to let it show, and has a reason to do that because the show introduces the Hollywood rule, um, the doorman clause, which basically makes it a problem if you're powered and trying to work in entertainment. That rule doesn't exist in the comics, and it changes everything. In the comics, he isn't living his life like if anyone finds out my career is over. In the show, that fear is always there. And kind of, you know, going back uh, to the Zemo thing in the comics, there's still a possibility that Zemo could be responsible. Um, like I said, it's very ambiguous, and it doesn't really give you something specific that resulted in Simon getting these powers as a kid. So I guess, the difference is instead of being an adult and um, his business kind of crashing and turning to Zemo, who tells him he can help him, um, and then ending up, hating Tony Stark because blaming him for what happened to the business, um, and ending up trying to do evil to the Avengers. That whole dynamic is not there in the show. I don't think I mean, it's very unclear in the show. I guess there's room for them to kind of incorporate that, especially the part where Zemo gives him his powers. I think it would be pretty hard for them to include the part where he doesn't like Tony Stark, obviously because Tony's dead in this universe, assuming it's the same Earth. And so I feel like, obviously that's not included. And another thing, obviously Simon could still join the Avengers. There could still be some angle where he joins this new Avengers team that they seem to have assembled um, in Thunderbolts. But they could have an angle where maybe something happened where they did him wrong, and now instead of him going after Tony Stark, it's him going after someone in that group. They could still kind of put their own angle on it, but it is different from the comics, a lot different. And kind of going back to the Dorman clause, because that's not in the comics either. Dorman is a character in the comics. He's not an actor, and no dormant clause is created because of him. And obviously that was created to keep or to kind of emphasize that Simon needs to keep his powers a secret, which again isn't in the comics. He's very public about his powers, and everyone knows he has them. Another difference is the actor setup. In the comics, Simon can become an actor and is an actor, but Wonder Man is still a real superhero identity in the real world. He's not playing Wonder Man as a role. He is Wonder Man, and acting is kind of something he does at times. The series makes it way more meta. Wonder Man exists as an in-universe movie being remade, and Simon is a struggling actor trying to land the part. So the order is basically flipped. The comics feel like superhero who later becomes an actor, but the show is actor with secret powers trying to become Wonder Man through Hollywood. He's not playing himself. He's playing a fictional version of a hero inside the MCU's entertainment world. And that kind of reversal also changes what Simon even wants. In the comics, his story pulls him toward the Avengers world, and superhero stakes in the show he's chasing acting first. He's not driven by, I want to be an Avenger. Superhero life feels like something that's getting in the way of his plan, not the plan itself. In the comics, his story pulls him toward the Avengers world and superhero stakes, and it becomes a full-on Avengers regular in later eras, like the Avengers issue 160 from 1977, where he joins the Avengers full-time. Now, it feels like the Disney Plus series is kind of hinting at something happening and Simon revealing himself, and obviously he's gonna become the real life Wonder Man in the show. It's kind of heading towards that, it feels like. But obviously, anything with the Avengers, which obviously he was a huge part of in the comics, is not really there in the show. Then you've got the supporting characters, which also get reshaped to fit the show's story. The biggest example is Trevor Slattery. In the series, Trevor becomes a major relationship for Simon and a big part of the tone. That's not a Wonder Man comics cornerstone. It's a very MCU specific choice that helps the show lean into the Hollywood satire and buddy dynamic. Obviously Trevor Slattery wasn't around in comics until I think Iron Man, when they did this like prelude to the movie. He was involved in the comic, but before then he wasn't a character. So he's he was included because of the MCU. Another thing, or another character rather, is that's different is Eric Williams, Simon's brother. In the comics, Eric is tied to darker superhero mythology and is strongly connected to the Grim Reaper side of Simon's story, um, which brings heavier, more intense drama into Simon's life. And obviously, the comics I'm referencing with the Grim Reaper, specifically the Grim Reaper debut from the Avengers issue 52. In the show, Eric is reworked to fit the grounded real life version of the story, more stable, more normal, more like part of Simon's everyday world than a dark comic book shadow hanging over him. Um, and then another thing, Eric isn't this stable person in the comics. He's troubled even before the Grim Reaper thing happens. Um, he's a criminal essentially, and this could still happen. The Grim Reaper thing. I could see this happening if a season two happens or beyond that. Um, they could definitely fit this in. This isn't something that's necessarily different. Just kind of the backstory of Eric Williams. Another big connection that Wonder Man has to the Avengers that is obviously not in the show or the movies because Wonder Man wasn't a character in the early MCU. He's tied to Vision, and it's big in the comics. And Simon is actually really important to the Avengers in this aspect in the comics. Um, and his legacy ties into Marvel history because his brain patterns are recorded and later used in the chain of events that leads to Vision's mind template. This happens in a couple of different comics. The Avengers issue 9, where his brain patterns are recorded, and then the Avengers issue 58, where, they revisit that and Vision first appears, and then issue 57 and, later stories where it explains that Wonder Man's brain pattern were used. And obviously they didn't do this because, like I said, he wasn't a character. So it would be kind of hard for them to, retcon that, or I don't even know how they would do that. It's kind of impossible without making some sort of change. But obviously there's this Vision TV show coming up. Um, Now that they've introduced Wonder Man, maybe they're gonna rework something where Wonder Man does has have a connection to Vision in the Vision series. So maybe they're gonna do something with that. But anyways, that Vision example is one of those, classic comic things where, it makes Wonder Man feel like he matters to the Avengers mythos beyond just, his powers. The Disney Plus series isn't built around that kind of deep continuity weight. It's intentionally more personal and more standalone, so those big lore tent poles aren't the center of it. And another example in the comics is when Vision's White Vision era comes up. Simon refuses to redonate his brain patterns, and this becomes, a major relationship thing with the Avengers. In this takes place in the West Coast, Volume 2, Issue 45. Um, that's technically something we could see in the new Vision series. He is, I believe, going to be White Vision. So maybe Simon appears in that, and maybe they kind of twist it in a way to where it makes sense in the MCU because obviously Wonder Man wasn't there when Vision was initially created. But we'll see what they end up doing with that. That could be interesting. And, obviously that's something that didn't happen in the show and happen in the comics, but could still happen. And obviously, another thing that's different is the way his powers are being used in the comics. And this is more so something that could show up in later seasons if they do, do that in Wonder Man. Because, in the first season, he doesn't really know how to use his powers, and they're kind of reactions to his emotional state. And, his powers in the comics are, his super strength. He's very durable. And in some later comics, he has, his powers are expanded to some weird energy stuff, depending on the era. But it's mostly, that stuff's mostly used in the middle of big Marvel plots. And like I said, in the series, his powers are more like something emotional and unstable that can blow up when he's overwhelmed. Which is why scenes like the childhood kitchen moment are, important to the series and um, Simon's character in the show overall. Another thing that's different is the DODC, and the DODC has been different in other shows too. In the comics, they're like this cleanup crew, pretty much, who clean up the mess after superheroes destroy things, or you know, essentially they handle the aftermath of any sort of fight or battle or anything like that. But in recent shows and movies, they're more like a police force than the cleanup crew. So obviously Simon never gets hunted by the DODC in the comics like he does in the show, and there's no one really posing as a double agent like the way uh, Trevor Slattery is. Um, in the comics, actually, Simon is the double agent because he's trying to get back at the Avengers. So it's kind of weird how they switched that. And obviously, this is like these differences in these comics are specifically from Earth 616. Obviously, there's alternate universes in the comics, and focusing specifically on the Earth that's in the MCU, because that's what it feels like they're adapting, just pointing out how they're different. So obviously, the show changed a lot from the comics. Some stuff it feels like they had to, especially with the Vision thing. It's not like they can go back and remake those movies and include Wonder Man in it, even though he was kind of a big part in the comics in that, or at least in some of the comics. In some of the other ones, he's not as big of a deal to the whole Vision creation, but obviously there's some stuff like with Eric Williams and his brother that we could see in later seasons, in terms of like the Grim Reaper angle, and then obviously his origin in the show. It's very ambiguous, which it feels like that's on purpose to kind of leave it open to interpretation or even leave the creators open to doing what they want with that. Um, I would like to see them use the Zemo thing because I think keeping it or at least adapting the comics a little bit is important, and obviously they can still do that. It would just change from the angle of, like I said, Simon wouldn't be an adult and he wouldn't, his business angle and him hating Tony Stark wouldn't really fit. It obviously happened when he was a kid, because they hint at him having powers as a kid. And then obviously there's he doesn't hide his powers in the comics, which is different. It's the series is more meta when it comes to Wonder Man in terms of Simon playing that character and not necessarily being him yet. But obviously, Simon can become an Avenger, and he could be a part of the new Avengers team that's being assembled. Because obviously they're going to need some firepower, and maybe Wonder Man can provide that. It doesn't really feel like he wants to be an Avenger, and that's something that is definitely in the comics. Um, so we'll see if his mindset changes. Again, if there's a season two, I would assume also he's going to learn how to use his powers, and we'll see a more, comic accurate version of him because of that. So, anyways, let me know what you think about this. Do you like the changes? Do you not like the changes? And would you like to see some of the stuff that could be incorporated, be incorporated in the future if they end up making a season two or not? Anyways, I thought it was interesting to kind of see the differences in that and um, kind of see how they can adapt things going forward. And anyways, if you're seeing this, let me know what you think. And that's it.